Right, so in a democracy, one that believes in freedom of speech and freedom of expression anyway, the right to dissent, peacefully of course, is supposed to be sacrosanct. The ability to criticise state policies, challenge injustice and advocate for the oppressed is not just a privilege, it is supposed to be the very foundation of a free society. Well, not under Keir Starmer it isn't, because not only is this not true, it is not true to frankly ridiculous proportions now. He has jumped the shark on this matter by several orders of magnitude at this point. What began as a disturbing trend of suppressing pro-Palestine voices has now descended into outright authoritarianism, with the UK's government weaponising anti-terror legislation to effectively criminalise solidarity with Palestine. But not only that, actually criminalise anyone standing up against the real thing now too. From arresting journalists and activists, as has been covered previously on this channel, to now detaining academics and even targeting an individual for wearing a Palestine-themed jumper, Starmer's crackdown has reached new levels of absurdity and repression. This has got nothing to do with fighting terrorism or defending our national security whatsoever. It is about enforcing political conformity, shielding Israel from accountability, and punishing those who dare to speak out against its atrocities. So the question is no longer whether Starmer's government is abusing its power, but rather whose interests is Keir Starmer really serving here by doing so. Right, so in recent months we have borne witness to more and more incidents of abuse of the UK's terror legislation, all adding up to a disturbing trend of weaponising that to silence pro-Palestine voices. Under Keir Starmer, the government has increasingly employed the Terrorism Act to target journalists and activists, and now even academics as well, who have expressed solidarity with Palestine. The Terrorism Act 2000 was supposedly passed to combat genuine threats to national security, but under Starmer's authoritarian regime, it has been repurposed. Instead, it is now increasingly being used to suppress dissenting opinions. One of the most egregious examples, which is once again back in the alternative news anyway, God forbid the mainstream ever cover such things, is the case of Richard Medhurst, the Syrian-born independent British journalist, son of Nobel Prize-winning humanitarian workers who's lived in and reported on experiences in the Middle East are basically second to none. He was literally raised amongst so much of what we bear witness to in this day and age on social media in the likes of Syria or Gaza, and combined with his dedication to legitimate journalism, the real deal, has apparently made himself a bit of a threat. Arrested last August as he was under the Terrorism Act, accused of supporting a proscribed group, he was later released and went on to stay in Austria, basing himself there for the last several months, where his apartments were also raided by Austrian authorities, in his mind at the behest of the British government, and who would frankly disagree with that when journalism is now apparently a crime when it means you call out Israeli genocide and stand up for those they oppress. Well, now Medhurst has been ordered to surrender to UK police at Heathrow Police Station on May 15th, officially under the suspicion of breaching anti-terrorism laws, but in reality it's because he dares to be an impartial Middle East journalist and reporter. Medhurst himself tweeted out on the matter saying, "Criminalisation of journalism. I must surrender myself at Heathrow Police Station in exactly 1 month, May 15th, unless they decide to drop their investigation, extend it again for the third time, or charge me under the Terrorism Act." This move, along with those that have come before, has been widely condemned as an attempt to intimidate and silence journalists by others in the independent and alternative news networks anyway, who challenge the government's stance on Israel. So nobody in the mainstream is saying a thing about any of this, of course. Similarly, other individuals have also faced legal action for their pro-Palestinian views, Medhurst's initial arrest being just the beginning of what has grown to be this disturbing trend. Journalist Sarah Wilkinson was also arrested. Activist Natalie Strecker arrested, charged and going on trial under terror legislation in Jersey for having done nothing more than call out Israel and stand up for Palestine. Electronic Intifada journalist Asa Winstanley had his home raided, and Jewish activist Tony Greenstein is also being put on trial, accused of supporting a proscribed organisation. All are critics of Israeli atrocity. The one common denominator here is that is. And so these actions suggest something of a coordinated establishment effort to suppress free expression and discourage public support for Palestine. But matters have worsened even further now, as the government's crackdown has extended beyond journalists and activists to now include academics. Professor Khoury-Machool, a British Palestinian scholar, He and his 8-year-old son were detained under Section 7 of the Terrorism Act, a provision that allows for questioning without any suspicion of terrorist intent whatsoever. It is defined as per Squawkbox's coverage of this story as Section 7 grants police and immigration officers the power to stop, question, search and detain individuals entering or leaving the UK at ports, airports or the border area, and, because they are detained rather than arrested, to refuse access to a lawyer and the right to remain silent and not answer questions. If arrested at a port, it is a criminal offence not to disclose device passwords, allowing the state to grossly invade the privacy of the victim. Section 7 does not even require actual suspicion of any involvement in terrorism. It is worded to allow detention if police say they want to find out if the person is or has been involved in the commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism. Therefore, this provision has been criticised for its potential for abuse. That seems fairly clear and obvious, as it grants authorities very broad powers to detain individuals without any evidence of any wrongdoing, a blunt tool to club people over the head with if they speak out of turn about matters the Starmer regime may frown deeply upon. The arrest of Professor Khoury-Machool underscores a troubling evolution of this abuse now, though, moving on from the journalism and activism to the potential criminalisation of academic discourse for the sake of Israel. Again, the common denominator. Scholars who engage in research or public commentary on Palestine, as Khoury-Machool has, he called out Starmer on Twitter last August, for example, over the case of Richard Medhurst, are increasingly at risk of legal repercussions themselves, threatening the fundamental principles of academic freedom and the free exchange of ideas. It's another facet of the clampdown on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And again, it all comes down to Israel. Keir Starmer, being who he is, though, a hypocrite as well as a liar, has publicly declared his commitment to protecting journalism despite everything that's going on. And he did this just last year, not 6 months ago, in fact, stating that journalism is the lifeblood of British democracy and pledging to combat strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPs as they're better known, to protect investigative journalism. Only if they're not investigating things you don't want investigated, though, eh, Keith? Or his actions, of course, tell a different story, don't they? While he has condemned these SLAPs in principle, his government has taken no concrete steps to outlaw them at all. And yet, far from doing that, Starmer's administration has failed to address the abuse of anti-terrorism laws to silence dissent, silence pro-Palestine voices, all behind the drive to silence pro-Palestine voices, by abusing the law seemingly themselves in order to do so. The misuse of anti-terrorism legislation to target pro-Palestinian voices has drawn criticism both domestically and internationally. It's not just me coming out with this, of course. The United Nations has expressed concerns over the UK's treatment of journalists and activists, a group of UN special rapporteurs back in February, warning that such actions violate international human rights standards. Additionally, a coalition of religious groups, Churches Together, which includes the Quakers, has condemned the government's aggressive tactics, citing incidents like the raid on the Quaker Meeting House in Westminster last month as evidence of governmental overreach in the repression of free speech and freedom of expression, not to mention freedom to protest, and of course freedom to worship in this case as well. But the most ridiculous and extreme example of overreach came just yesterday, with the detainment of an individual at Heathrow Airport for wearing a jumper featuring a map of Palestine. And even more crazily, they were detained not under the Terrorism Act this time, but under the Firearms Act. Apparently jumpers are now firearms. How else could that be interpreted? Authorities detained this man, seemingly equating a piece of clothing with a map of Palestine, decorating the front, in the pattern of the keffiyeh at that, on the front of it, with a weapon. The weapon for the people doing the arrests. What weapons they were. What had this person done exactly, apart from wear a jumper then? Well, he had attempted to raise the alarm to the police of the war criminal that passes for Israel's foreign minister, Gideon Saar, leaving the UK, having enjoyed secret meetings with David Lammy and the Board of Deputies of British Jews, for which Lammy had provided him with diplomatic immunity. And that immunity, it seems, can get you arrested for wearing a jumper if you go to the police and say, "Can't you arrest that man? He's a war criminal." There's no extent to which the Starmer regime won't stretch to cover for Israel. It is so out of control now, it's crazy. So in response to these developments, a petition has now been launched calling for the repeal of the Terrorism Act 2000 and the Terrorism Act 2006. The petition has been co-sponsored by former Labour MP Chris Williamson, and it seeks to end the government's use of anti-terrorism laws to stifle free speech and dissent. It is not getting nearly enough attention, though. So if you are sick and tired, as I am, of this government abusing UK law for the sake of a foreign nation committing genocide and all manner of other atrocities on other war fronts for no other reason than to keep Benjamin Netanyahu's disgusting backside in power, please sign it. I will, as ever, attach the petition to the YouTube comments. Either we take a stand and make ourselves heard against the erosion of civil liberties and this government's disregard for democratic principles, or we're just sitting on our hands and just letting it happen again, aren't we? The actions of Keir Starmer's government are a grave misuse of UK law to suppress pro-Palestinian voices wherever they come from journalists to academics. By weaponising anti-terrorism legislation, the government is undermining the fundamental rights of its citizens and betraying its commitment to democracy and to free speech, which is all of our right. The international community's criticism and the domestic outcry against these practices ought to be serving as a bit of a wake-up call to all of us of the importance of safeguarding our own civil liberties, because if we sit by and let this carry on, we will lose them. At the start, I asked who is Keir Starmer really serving, and the answer really is not the British people here. Not when journalists reporting the truth get arrested for doing that. Not when people wearing dangerous jumpers get detained. Not when academics lose their academic freedom for speaking out for Palestine. Not when the UN are condemning the government, and not when churches of all manner of denominations here in the UK are doing likewise as well. If they can find their voices, if they can stand up to the government in spite of what they face, we can all, at bare minimum, sign a ruddy petition, can't we? For more on Lammy and the BAD meeting Gideon Saar, not to mention the mainstream media cover-up surrounding it, almost as big a story in and of itself, most notably by the BBC here, collusion with the Starmer regime as this ostensibly appears to be, do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as supporting the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.